Far beyond the bright arms of the Orion Spur, where stars burned cold and strange, there was a small blue world called Varus 9. It was a peaceful planet, home to a race known as the Varisians, tall, graceful beings with eyes that shimmered like crystal water. They were not warriors. They were thinkers, builders, and dreamers. Their cities were full of light, art, and music. They believed that knowledge and kindness were the true signs of a great civilization. For hundreds of years, Varus 9 had been a safe place, untouched by war. Children played in the floating gardens, scientists studied the stars, and families believed that peace would last forever. But peace is fragile, and sometimes the universe has a cruel way of reminding even the most advanced worlds that safety is never certain. One cold morning, the skies of Varus 9 changed. What began as a whisper on the outer sensors quickly turned into a nightmare. Dozens of warships appeared at the edge of their system, black and sharp like blades against the stars. They came from the Vrax Dominion, a brutal empire known across the galaxy for conquering and enslaving weaker species. The Vrax believed that only strength deserved survival, and to them, Varus 9 was nothing more than a new resource to claim, a jewel to add to their growing empire. The Varisian defense fleet was small, built for exploration, not war. Their ships were graceful, built for speed and science, not battle. When the Vrax descended, Varisian ships tried to hold them back, but their weapons barely scratched the invaders' armor. The skies turned red as cities burned. Energy cannons rained fire down on the planet's surface, and the once beautiful skylines of crystal towers fell into dust and flame. Across the planet, panic spread. People ran for the underground shelters, clutching their children and hoping that somehow, someone would come to save them. But deep down they knew no one would. The Vrax Dominion had destroyed dozens of worlds before, and no one had ever dared to interfere. To challenge them meant death. Inside the Varisian capital, in a tower that still stood despite the bombardment, a group of scientists and communication officers gathered in the last surviving command center. The air trembled with the sound of distant explosions. The leader, a woman named Saralyn, stood before the ancient beacon controls. Her face was pale, her voice shaking, but her eyes were full of determination. "We send the signal," she said quietly. "Even if no one comes, the universe will know we tried." Her team hesitated. They all knew what it meant. Sending a distress signal into deep space was an act of desperation. Most civilizations ignored such calls. Helping outsiders meant risking their own worlds. It meant war, and few were willing to pay that price. But Saralyn pressed her hand to the console, and the beacon came to life. A pulse of blue light shot into the heavens, a desperate cry for help that carried across the endless dark. It was coded in every known galactic frequency, a message that could be understood by any species capable of hearing it. It said only this: "This is Varus 9, we are under attack. Our people are dying, please, help us." Hours passed, then days. The signal traveled faster than light, crossing star systems, moving through clouds of dust and silence. On Varus 9, the situation grew worse. The Vrax army landed on the surface, their machines towering like black giants. They rounded up survivors, forcing them into labor camps. Cities that once sang with music now echoed with the sounds of despair. Saralyn watched from the broken windows of the communication tower as her world fell apart. She had done everything she could. Now she could only hope, even though hope felt useless. Meanwhile, light years away, the signal kept traveling. It reached one of the great galactic relay stations, an automated network that bounced communications from one civilization to another. Most of those receivers ignored it, their AI systems marking it as low priority, but one receiver didn't ignore it. In a quiet corner of human space, orbiting a moon called Elysian, the Earth Exploration Network picked up the signal. For a moment, it was just another data burst among thousands, but when the translators processed it, the message appeared on the main console of Deep Space Station Delta 4. The duty officer on watch, Lieutenant Harrow, frowned at the screen. "Unidentified distress call. Origin Varus 9, he muttered. He played it again. The voice was trembling, broken, full of fear. He had heard many strange signals in his career. Lost probes, ghost transmissions, even ancient broadcasts from extinct worlds. But this one felt different. It felt human in its pain. Harrow reported the signal up the chain of command. Within minutes, it reached the United Earth Defense Network, and from there, the Deathworlder command fleet. The Deathworlders. That was what the galaxy called humans. The name had started as an insult. Earth, classified as a Class 12 death world, was a planet filled with storms, diseases, and predators. Every creature that survived there had to be strong, clever, and relentless. Humans had evolved in chaos, and that chaos had forged something terrifyingly resilient. Other species looked at humans and whispered that they were too dangerous, too unpredictable, too emotional. But the truth was simpler. Humans had learned to fight not because they loved war, but because they hated losing what they cared about. In the command chamber of the fleet flagship ISS Resolute, Admiral Sarah Keene listened to the recording of Varus 9's call. Around her, holographic maps glowed, showing the location of the planet deep in hostile territory. It would take days to reach it, and there was no guarantee they could win if they tried. Her second-in-command, Commander Holt, studied the data grimly. "Ma'am, we can't commit to this. Varus 9 is in Dominion space. If we move in, we'll be declaring war." Keene didn't answer right away. She looked out through the viewport, where the curve of Earth's colony world shimmered below. She thought about how many times humanity had been alone, how often they had sent distress signals into the void and received only silence. Finally, she spoke. "If we don't go, who will?" The room went quiet. The Deathworlder fleet was known for its strength, but also for its independence. They answered to no one but their own command, and they made their own choices. Holt sighed. "You're really doing this?" Keene nodded once. "Prepare the fleet." Within hours, the message spread through the ranks. Battleships, cruisers, and carriers began loading supplies and ammunition. The crews knew the risks. Many wouldn't come back, but not a single ship refused. Because that was the thing about humans. When someone cried for help, they didn't ask whether it was their problem. They simply answered. As the fleet engines roared to life, hundreds of voices echoed through the corridors. Engineers sealing hatches, soldiers preparing gear, medics readying field hospitals. In the hangar, pilots painted a single word on their ships: Varus 9. The human fleet turned toward the coordinates of a world none of them had ever seen, a world on fire, waiting for a miracle. And somewhere in the dark between stars, the faint pulse of Varus 9's beacon continued to beat, unaware that its call had reached a species forged in storms, a people from a planet of predators who had learned compassion through struggle. The Varisians had sent their cry into the void, expecting nothing but silence. But the universe was about to answer them, in the form of the Deathworlders of Earth. The message from Varus 9 traveled through hundreds of communication relays, crossing star systems and dust clouds, until it finally reached human space. On the central command ship ISS Resolute, the transmission came through as a faint, trembling voice, broken, full of static, and soaked in fear. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of an entire world. "This is Varus 9. We are under attack. Our people are dying. Please, help us." In her command chamber, Admiral Sarah Keene stood still, her eyes fixed on the holographic display that showed the origin of the signal. The coordinates blinked in red, deep inside territory controlled by the Vrax Dominion, one of the most dangerous and ruthless empires in the known galaxy. Around her, the quiet hum of the command center mixed with the distant pulse of engines. Officers waited for her response, watching the flickering light that represented a dying world. Admiral Keene was a woman shaped by war. She had seen cities burn, colonies fall, and men and women give their lives for others. The scars of old battles lined her face, reminders of Earth's long struggle to survive in a galaxy that often saw humanity as a threat. Even now, years after the last great conflict, the colonies were still rebuilding. Resources were scarce, fleets were tired, and the people needed peace. But peace, she knew, was never free. She played the Varus 9 transmission again. The sound of explosions and terrified voices filled the room. Somewhere out there, an entire civilization was being wiped out, and their only hope was that someone, anyone, might hear them. Commander Holt, her trusted second-in-command, stepped closer. "Ma'am, I have to say this," he began cautiously. "Varus 9 is deep in Dominion territory. That's enemy space. If we go in, we'll be crossing the line. We could start another war," another officer added. "Our fleets are stretched thin. We barely have enough supplies for our own defense posts, and we don't even know these aliens. This isn't our fight." Keene said nothing. Her gaze remained locked on the star map. The coordinates shimmered faintly, surrounded by the glowing red borders that marked the edge of Dominion control. It was suicide to send ships there. Every logical voice in her head told her to ignore the signal. Let someone else handle it. Let the galaxy turn away as it always did. But deep inside, something in her refused to stay silent. She remembered humanity's own dark years, the time when Earth had sent out distress calls during the Great Collapse, when colonies had been starving, isolated, begging for help from other species. None had answered. The galaxy had watched humanity struggle and survive on its own, and when they finally emerged strong again, the other races called them Deathworlders, beings forged by danger, too fierce and unpredictable to be trusted. But Sarah Keene had always believed the title meant something different. It wasn't just about being dangerous. It was about enduring the impossible and still choosing compassion afterward. She turned to Holt. "You said this isn't our fight," she said quietly. "Maybe you're right. But if we walk away, then what are we? The galaxy already fears us. Maybe it's time they saw what else we can be." The room went silent. Holt looked at her for a long moment, his jaw tightening. He had served with Keene for years. He had seen her make impossible decisions before, and somehow she always made the right one even when it hurt. "So," he said finally, "what's your order?" Keene looked once more at the blinking red dot that marked Varus 9. Then she gave the simplest answer possible. "Prepare the fleet," no speech. No ceremony. Just a command. Quiet, clear, and absolute. Within minutes, the Human Defense Expeditionary Corps came alive. Across the orbiting docks of Elysian Station, alarms echoed and lights flared. Crews raced through metallic corridors. Pilots climbed into their ships, their helmets reflecting the bright glow of the hangars. Engineers rechecked reactor cores and rearmed missile bays. Medical officers stocked supplies, knowing what that order meant, knowing they were heading into danger. For many of them, it had been years since their last real battle. Some were veterans who had sworn never to fight again. Others were new recruits who had grown up hearing stories of Earth's brutal wars. But when the call came, all units ready for deployment, not one hesitated. Word spread quickly through the fleet. A world was dying, and humanity was going to help. Some whispered that the Admiral had gone too far. Others said this was exactly who humans were, unpredictable, reckless, but always standing between the weak and the strong. In the crew quarters of the Resolute, Lieutenant Mara Ellis wrote a short message to her younger brother on Earth. "We're going somewhere far, somewhere we're not supposed to go, but the Admiral says someone needs us. Don't worry, we'll make it back." "We always do." The ships began to align, forming the massive spearhead formation of the Deathworlder fleet. Each vessel was marked with the old Earth insignia, a blue and green world surrounded by stars. They were a reminder of where it all began, a dangerous, beautiful planet that had forced humans to become strong enough to survive anywhere. As preparations continued, Admiral Keene stood on the observation deck, watching the stars slide by. The light of distant suns reflected in her eyes. She thought about the risks, how many lives could be lost, how this could undo everything they had built since the last war. But she also thought about that trembling voice from Varus 9, about the quiet desperation in the words, "Please, help us." Maybe the Vrax Dominion would see this as an act of defiance. Maybe they would call it madness. But Keene didn't care. There were times when reason and strategy weren't enough. Times when doing the right thing mattered more than survival. "Ma'am," Holt said behind her, "the fleet is ready." "All systems green," she nodded. "Plot a course for Varus 9. The stars outside the viewport began to shift as the navigation drives came online. The hum of power filled the ship, the sound of thousands of engines awakening, of humanity preparing to move once again into the unknown. Across the communication network, a single phrase echoed through every ship, every channel, every heart that beat inside the fleet. Mission priority, Varus 9 distress response. No one gets left behind. For the first time in decades, the Deathworlders were mobilizing not to defend their own, not to conquer, but to protect strangers, beings who had never even met a human before. It didn't matter. The decision had been made. Outside, the engines flared white-hot as the fleet accelerated toward the edge of known space. One by one, the ships vanished into faster-than-light corridors, leaving trails of blue light in the dark. Back in the empty command chamber, The transmission from Varus 9 still played on a loop, faint, broken, full of pain. But now, somewhere in the endless night, a reply was on its way. The galaxy didn't know it yet, but the Deathworlders were coming, not as monsters or conquerors, but as the kind of warriors only Earth could create, strong enough to destroy, yet brave enough to save. And for Admiral Sarah Keene, it wasn't about politics or power or even victory. It was about something much simpler, something that had always defined humanity: the refusal to ignore a cry for help, no matter how far away it came from. As the last of the stars blurred into light, Keene whispered to herself, "Then it's our choice." And with that, the Deathworlder fleet disappeared into the void, heading toward a battle no one had asked them to fight, but one that only they could answer. When the human ships finally reached Varus 9, the world below was almost gone. From orbit, the planet looked wounded. Oceans boiled in places, cities burned like dying stars, and the night side flickered with the faint orange glow of firestorms. The once beautiful blue-green world of scholars and artists was now little more than a battlefield. The Vrax Dominion had almost finished its work. The Varisians had fought as best they could, but their defenses were broken. Their grand towers, built from shining crystal and metal, now lay in ruins. Smoke rose into the upper atmosphere, mixing with ash and lightning. Millions had already been captured or killed. Those who remained had gone underground, hiding in the deep tunnels beneath their shattered cities. The people prayed, not for victory but for a miracle, and then something impossible happened. The skies above Varus 9 lit up with streaks of blue light. Sensors on the ground detected dozens of massive energy signatures entering orbit. The Vrax ships moved quickly, forming tight defensive lines, expecting another alien force trying to challenge their dominance. But what appeared wasn't a small fleet. It was a wall of metal and fire. Humanity had arrived. From the bridge of the flagship ISS Resolute, Admiral Sarah Keene watched the battlefield unfold. Around her, officers called out tactical data, energy readings, and combat reports. The Vrax fleet was larger, but their formation was sloppy. They had grown arrogant after crushing so many weak worlds. They didn't expect the newcomers to fight back with such precision or such fury. "Target their command vessels," Keene ordered calmly. "We break the head, the body falls." In seconds, the void between the fleets erupted. Human railguns fired kinetic rounds at near-light speeds, tearing through Vrax armor like paper. Missiles screamed through space, guided by AI systems that predicted enemy movement before it happened. The first Vrax battleship exploded in a silent bloom of light, scattering debris across the stars. On Varus 9's surface, the survivors looked up from their shelters as the sky flashed. For a brief moment, they thought the end had come. Another bombardment, another horror. But then they noticed something strange. The explosions were not striking their cities. They were striking the enemy. The Vrax tried to regroup, but humanity's assault was relentless. Human ships moved in coordinated formations, each protecting the others. Their weapons were not the most advanced in the galaxy, but they were used with terrifying skill. The Deathworlders fought like a storm, unpredictable, overwhelming, alive. When the last Vrax cruiser broke formation and tried to flee, Keene's voice came over the comm. "No survivors," she said, her tone like steel. "Not after what they've done." Moments later, the fleeing ship was gone, vaporized by a precision strike. The orbital battle lasted less than 2 hours. When it ended, the skies of Varus 9 were clear again, except for the burning wrecks of enemy vessels falling through the atmosphere like shooting stars. But the fight wasn't over. It had only changed shape. "Prepare ground teams," Keene ordered. "We're going in." Dropships launched from the fleet like swarms of silver arrows piercing through the smoke and fire. The atmosphere burned against their hulls as they descended. No other species would have dared to land in such chaos. Radiation storms, enemy resistance, collapsing structures. But humans were different. They came from a world where danger was normal. They knew how to survive when everything was falling apart. When the first dropships hit the ground, their ramps opened, and armored soldiers rushed out, the Deathworlder Marines. They moved fast, covering one another, their visors glowing in the dim light. They weren't there to conquer. They were there to save. The Varisians, hiding in the tunnels below the city, could hardly believe what they saw. Through cracks in the rubble, they saw figures in dark armor moving through the flames, dragging survivors out of destroyed buildings, lifting heavy debris as if it weighed nothing. One Marine carried a wounded Varisian child in his arms, shielding her from falling glass as he sprinted toward a waiting shuttle. Another stayed behind to cover his team, holding a defensive line against Vrak's ground troops until the last civilian had escaped. The humans didn't move like ordinary soldiers. They didn't hesitate. They didn't run from danger. They went toward it. Every street of Varus 9 became a battlefield of rescue and resistance. In one ruined plaza, Captain Mara Ellis's squad found hundreds of Varisian civilians trapped beneath the collapsed dome of a cultural center. The air was thick with smoke and enemy drones patrolled overhead. Ellis ordered her team to use portable shields to create a safe path. The Marines worked for hours, sweating under their armor, pulling people out one by one. When the drones attacked, they shot them down with ruthless precision, never missing a target. Elsewhere, in the ruins of the capital, Commander Holt coordinated evacuation routes. Human engineers repurposed combat transports into ambulances. Medics treated the wounded, Varisian and human alike, with whatever supplies they had. No one asked for names or species. A heartbeat was enough reason to save someone. Above, the remaining Vrak ships tried to bombard the surface, desperate to destroy what they couldn't control. But every time they fired, human cruisers intercepted the attacks, placing themselves between the enemy and the planet. More than one ship was lost doing this. Entire crews gave their lives to protect strangers they had never met. On the ground, the Varisians began to realize who these newcomers were. They had heard the legends, the Deathworlders, the humans from a violent planet who were said to be unpredictable and terrifying. Other species feared them, calling them dangerous, unstable. But now, as they watched these same beings risk everything to save lives, they saw something different. The Varisians saw soldiers who fought like the wrath of nature itself, fierce, unstoppable, full of fury, yet guided by a compassion that burned even brighter than their weapons. One Varisian elder later described it in her memoirs. They came through fire and death, not for glory, not for conquest. They came because they could not bear to do nothing. When we saw them, we understood that their world must be one of storms and monsters, for only such a world could create hearts so strong. The battle on Varus 9 lasted 9 days. The Deathworlders pushed the Vrak's forces back inch by inch, street by street. Every victory was paid for with blood. They fought in toxic air, through acid rain, in crumbling ruins where no sane being would dare to stand, but they never stopped. They refused to leave anyone behind. By the time the last Vrak's transport exploded in the upper atmosphere, the humans were exhausted, their armor scorched, their ships damaged. But they had done the impossible. They had saved a world that wasn't theirs. When the survivors emerged from the tunnels, they looked upon their ruined planet with tears in their eyes. The skies were still filled with smoke, but for the first time in weeks, the stars could be seen again. And among those stars, they saw the faint silhouettes of human ships standing guard, silent, powerful, watchful. To the Varisians, those ships were not just metal and fire. They were a promise, proof that even in a galaxy full of fear and cruelty, there were still those willing to answer a cry for help. For humanity, the mission was never about politics or power. It was about something older, something written deep in the heart of every human who had ever lived on that dangerous little world called Earth. The belief that life, any life, was worth fighting for. And as the last dropship lifted off, carrying the final group of survivors, a Varisian child looked up at the departing fleet and whispered words her mother would never forget. The stars sent us monsters, but they were our angels. The battle for Varus 9 dragged on for 9 long, brutal days. It was not a clean or glorious war. It was chaos, smoke, blood, and fire. The once beautiful planet had turned into a graveyard of metal and ash. Every sunrise brought new destruction, and every night the survivors wondered if they would see another dawn. For the Deathworlders, those 9 days felt like a lifetime. The humans had come to help, not to conquer, but the cost of their compassion was heavier than any of them expected. From orbit, their ships kept up constant bombardment against the Vrak's reinforcements. On the surface, soldiers fought in the ruins of burning cities, holding the line so that civilians could escape. They fought without rest, without sleep, fueled only by determination and the desperate will to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Entire units were lost holding evacuation corridors. In the city of Marith Prime, a team of 50 Marines volunteered to guard the last civilian convoy. They knew the Vraks were closing in, thousands of enemy troops armed with plasma cannons and drones. But they didn't move from their post. They fought until the very end, buying enough time for the transports to lift off. When the last shuttle cleared the ground, their signal disappeared from the map. No one ever heard from them again. Their sacrifice became a symbol for the entire fleet. It reminded everyone what they were fighting for. Not land, not resources, but lives. Every soldier on Varus 9 knew they might not make it back, but none of them backed down. In orbit, Admiral Sarah Keene barely left the command deck of the ISS Resolute. Her face was pale from exhaustion, her voice hoarse from shouting orders, but her eyes burned with focus. She watched as reports flooded in. Ship damage, casualty lists, emergency transmissions from the surface. The numbers were devastating, but she couldn't afford to grieve. Not yet. Admiral, one of her officers called out. Enemy reinforcements incoming. A full Vrax fleet. They're jumping in from hyperspace. Keene turned toward the holographic screen. The image flickered to life, showing dozens of red blips. Enemy warships approaching fast. They had sent another armada to finish what the first one could not. Humanity was outnumbered 3-1. The Vraks were furious that mortals from a death world had dared to interfere with their conquest. Commander Holt's voice broke through the noise. Ma'am, if they break orbit, the evacuation ships will be caught in the crossfire. We can't stop them all? Keene didn't hesitate. Then we don't let them reach the planet. She looked at the tactical display again, her mind racing. Every option seemed hopeless. The fleet had already suffered heavy losses. Ammunition was running low and the energy shields on most ships were failing. But giving up wasn't in her nature. She had seen humanity rise from worse, from the ashes of ruined cities and broken worlds. They hadn't come this far to let another civilization die. Divert all power to the forward batteries, she ordered. Have the Resolute hold the line. Ma'am, Holt said, his voice tense. That will overload our reactors. I know, she replied quietly. That's why I'll stay on the bridge. Her officers froze, realizing what she intended. The plan was madness, a controlled reactor detonation. If executed perfectly, it would unleash a massive energy pulse that could destroy the enemy fleet. But if anything went wrong, it would also consume their own ship in the explosion. Still, there was no other choice. The evacuation transports were still climbing through the atmosphere, loaded with Varisian civilians. If the Vrak ships broke through, all those people would die. Keene's voice came through the comms, calm and steady. To all ships of the Deathworlder fleet, fall back and form a perimeter. The Resolute will engage the primary enemy formation. This is not a retreat. This is survival. Get those civilians home. One by one, the other captains acknowledged the order. They knew what she was doing. They also knew she wasn't planning to survive it. The Resolute turned toward the enemy fleet, its engines glowing bright blue. The Vrax Armada opened fire, their plasma cannons filling space with light. The human flagship shook violently as impacts hit its hull. Systems failed. Alarms screamed, sparks flew across the bridge. Still, Keene stood firm. Activate the core sequence, she ordered. The ship's AI confirmed. Warning, detonation protocol will cause total system collapse. I'm aware, she said softly. Begin countdown. Outside, the battle reached its peak. The Vrax fleet surrounded the Resolute, confident in their victory. They didn't realize what the humans were about to do. The ship's reactor glowed brighter and brighter, energy building beyond its limits. Keene gripped the console tightly, her eyes fixed on the view of Varus 9 below, the planet she had sworn to protect. For a brief moment, she saw light breaking through the smoke clouds. It gave her peace. Commander Holt, she said over the comm, take the fleet out of range. But Admiral, that's an order. Holt hesitated, then saluted. See you on the other side, ma'am. Keene smiled faintly. Not today. Then she turned back to the reactor controls. Now, she whispered. A blinding wave of light burst from the Resolute. The explosion was silent in the vacuum of space, but powerful enough to shake the entire orbit. The shockwave tore through the Vrax fleet, ripping their ships apart in an instant. Every hostile vessel within range disintegrated under the blast. When the light faded, only silence remained. The once crowded battlefield was now filled with wreckage, fragments of metal drifting like dust among the stars. From a distance, The surviving human ships watched in awe. The Resolute was gone, but the planet below was safe. Admiral Keen's final order had worked. Her sacrifice, and the sacrifice of thousands under her command, had stopped the Dominion invasion once and for all. Hours later, rescue teams searched for survivors among the debris. Against all odds, they found an emergency capsule floating near the wreckage. Inside, unconscious but alive, was Admiral Keen. She had been thrown clear of the explosion by an automated escape pod triggered at the last second by the ship's AI. When she awoke in the medbay days later, Holt was there. "You did it, ma'am," he said quietly. "Varus 9 still stands." Keen didn't respond immediately. She stared at the holographic projection of the planet, half in ruins but alive. Cities lay in ashes, but life was returning. Evacuation ships were landing again, bringing back the rescued. The Varisians were already beginning to rebuild. For the first time in its long history, an alien world had survived, not because of its own strength, but because strangers had come to help. Strangers from a deadly planet who owed them nothing. The Varisians would never forget that. In the years to come, they would tell stories of the Deathworlders who came through fire and darkness to save them. They would teach their children about the fleet that fought for people they didn't even know. And among those stories, one name would always be spoken with reverence: Admiral Sarah Keen, the woman who chose compassion over safety, courage over fear, and hope over survival. As she watched Varus 9 slowly heal, she whispered to herself, half in ruins, but alive. In that moment, she understood something profound: that sometimes the greatest victories are not the ones where you win everything, but the ones where you refuse to lose what truly matters. Years passed after the Battle of Varus 9. The planet, once burned and broken, began to heal. The scars of war still remained: blackened soil, shattered towers, and craters that marked where entire cities had once stood. But life slowly returned. The Varisians rebuilt their homes, planting gardens where fire had once raged, raising new buildings where ruins had crumbled. Yet in the heart of their capital stood something unlike anything else: a monument that symbolized hope born from destruction. It was not made entirely of their own materials. The Varisians had requested help from Earth, and together they forged something extraordinary. The monument was built from alien stone and human steel, fused seamlessly together. Rising tall under the twin suns of Varus 9, it shimmered with a mix of pale silver and deep blue, colors that represented both worlds. At its center were two enormous hands carved with great care, one of Varisian design, elegant and elongated with fine ridges along the fingers, and the other, unmistakably human, rough, strong, with visible lines and texture. The two hands reached toward each other and clasped tightly, as if to promise that no distance, no difference could ever separate compassion and courage again. On the base of the monument was an inscription engraved in both Varisian script and the English language of Earth. It read simply, "They came not for conquest, but for compassion." Visitors often stopped before those words in silence. Veterans of the war, survivors of the siege, and even travelers from distant worlds would stand there feeling the weight of that sentence. It wasn't just a tribute to the soldiers who had fought and died. It was a reminder of something larger: the idea that strength, true strength, was not about domination, but about empathy. Every year, on the anniversary of the battle, a ceremony was held at the monument. The Varisian chancellor would lay a wreath of silver vines, a native plant that symbolized remembrance, and human representatives would bring a small flame, lit from the eternal torch at Earth's united memorial of the fallen. Together, the two gestures represented life and light, memory and endurance. Children from Varisian schools were taught the story from a young age. Their lessons began with how their ancestors had once believed that help from other species was a myth, that no one would risk themselves for strangers. But when they learned of the Deathworlders, everything changed. The term Deathworlders had once filled the galaxy with fear. To most species, Earth was considered a terrifying planet, a place of storms, diseases, predators, and endless environmental dangers. The beings who evolved there were thought to be too aggressive, too unpredictable, too wild to be trusted. But after Varus 9, that reputation transformed completely. Now, when someone mentioned Deathworlders, the word carried a different meaning. It meant protectors. It meant those who ran toward danger instead of away from it. It meant beings who, despite their fierce nature, could show kindness that others could not comprehend. The story spread far beyond the Orion Spur. Traders, travelers, and storytellers carried it from system to system. Songs were written about the battle for Varus 9. Poems told of Admiral Keen's courage, and even distant colonies sculpted smaller versions of the monument to remind themselves of what humanity had done. In time, the Varisian historians called that event the Day of Compassion. And for them, it became more than just a moment in history. It became a philosophy. When neighboring worlds faced famine or crisis, Varus 9 was among the first to send aid, inspired by the example of the Deathworlders. Admiral Sarah Keen herself visited the monument years later. Her hair was streaked with gray, and the medals on her chest felt heavy, but her eyes still held the same quiet strength. She stood before the sculpture for a long time, looking up at the joined hands. Around her, Varisian children laughed and played in the gardens that had once been battlefields. One of the children approached her, a little Varisian girl with bright amber eyes. She looked up and asked shyly, "Were you one of the humans who saved us?" Keen smiled softly and nodded. "I was," she said. The child tilted her head. "Why did you come? You didn't even know us." Keen knelt beside her, the warm light of the suns reflecting off her uniform. "Because someone had to," she replied, "and because we could." The girl thought for a moment, then reached out and gently placed her small hand over Keen's. It was a gesture of thanks that needed no translation. As the Admiral walked away, she turned one last time to look at the monument. In that instant, she realized that what humanity had given Varus 9 was not just survival, it was belief. Belief that compassion could exist even in the darkest times, and that courage was not measured by the number of enemies defeated, but by the lives saved. The message of Varus 9 rippled across the galaxy. Civilizations that had once stayed silent when others cried for help began to reconsider. Alliances were formed between species that had once been enemies. Even the most advanced empires started sending aid ships to disaster zones, following the example set by the humans. It became a quiet revolution, not one of weapons, but of empathy. And so when distress beacons went out from distant worlds, people began to ask the same hopeful question: will the Deathworlders hear us? Many believed it was just a saying, a legend born from war. But somewhere, beyond the galactic rim, far from any settled system, humanity's long-range network still listened. The sensors drifted among the stars, always waiting, always scanning. One day a faint signal appeared in the darkness, a cry for help from an unknown world. The message was weak, distorted, but its meaning was clear. Another civilization was in danger. Deep within the command center of the Human Defense Network, a familiar alert tone echoed through the chamber. Officers looked up from their stations. The holographic map showed the coordinates of the distress signal blinking in red. The room fell silent for a moment. Then a young officer turned to her superior and asked quietly, "Sir, do we respond?" The commander, an older man who had once served under Admiral Keen, looked at the display and smiled faintly. "Of course we respond," he said. "We always do." Within hours, ships began to mobilize. Engines roared to life, crews prepared for departure, and across the fleet, the same message was transmitted to every vessel. New SOS detected. Prepare to assist. In the dark sea of space, the massive ships of the Deathworlder fleet emerged from hyperspace, their hulls gleaming against the stars. Each one bore the same insignia, two hands clasped together, one human, one alien. And so once again the galaxy watched as the Deathworlders moved toward the unknown, not to conquer, not to claim, but to protect. On Varus 9, the monument still stood tall under the twin suns, its shadow stretching across the plaza. The words on its base caught the light and glimmered like fire. They came not for conquest but for compassion. Travelers who saw it would often pause and whisper the final line of the tale, the one that had become a promise carried by every human ship among the stars. And somewhere beyond the galactic rim, the Deathworlders are still listening. That promise became humanity's legacy. Not of fear, but of faith. Faith that no cry for help would ever go unanswered again.